stayed in Canada permanently in Georgetown until their move to Simcoe 15 years ago or so, and became Canadian citizens. Although he was never very demonstrative, he loved his boys, so much so that at age 76 he put his home of over 40 years up for sale in Georgetown, left his town, his friends, his church, to be closer to his sons and their families, Kimberly, myself, Scotty, Holly, Grace, Meriden, Ruth. This is true love. I have never met a man more methodical. The above is a chronology of his life, but now let's talk about the man himself. I have never met a man slower or more methodical than Jim Bennett. No matter what he attempted, he analyzed it to death before, during, and after, and reanalyzed it several times throughout the process, and analyzed it after it was complete to see if it could have been done better. I remember 30 years ago when he painted the bathroom door. He didn't get around to replacing the doorknob for many years, so he stuck a face cloth in the hole for privacy. Jim Bennett always did things on his own schedule and always had so many projects on the go at one time that he never seemed to finish anything. The worst part was that all of his projects took place on the kitchen table in the midst of Mom trying to cook dinner, but she never complained. When Dad asked me to do his eulogy, I told him that I would be telling stories about his cheapness. He said that that was okay, but I was to call it frugalness. But I guess the word cheapness just kind of slid in there. So before I begin, he did give me permission. As a matter of fact, he often joked about his cheapness. And when he recently read a book titled 1,000 Ways to Save Money, he wrote the author because several money-saving ideas had been missed. One of my favorite stories happened a few years ago. Mom and Dad were going to England for what would turn out to be their last time. Dad asked if he could borrow my luggage. He told me that to make it easier to identify at the airport in London, he was going to paint it yellow. Silly me, I thought he was kidding. When he returned my luggage, to my horror, it was painted fluorescent yellow. Another of my favorite stories is when he phoned me and he said, "Deb, I just watched Crossroads, and they're recommending a book that costs about $15. He said, "Deb, when you buy this book, can I borrow it?" I really had no intention of buying the book, but being a good daughter-in-law, I bought the book, lent it to him, and never got it back. Yet he had moments when he would blow the dust off his wallet, throw caution to the wind, and pursue his passion of travel. I couldn't begin to count how many trips Mom and Dad made over the years, including one around the world for Mom's 60th birthday. Jim Bennett had several God-given talents, including ambulance attending, organ playing, and gardening, but he had a gift for working with his hands that was beyond compare. He was a craftsman who could make drills and lathes and saws sing, yet he couldn't make the microwave or the VCR do anything. Another of his loves was his love of the Lord. As a child, Dad was always God-fearing. He grew up believing in God. Jesus was the Son of God, and Jesus died on the cross for us. He played the organ in the church and periodically read his Bible, but he never pursued it further. Mom, David, and Mark were saved in the early 1980s, and Dad kept hearing about being born again, but he just tried to ignore it. One day, the church rented a couple of buses to go to see Billy Graham in Hamilton. He figured he would go along for the ride, but there was absolutely no way he was going to the front of the stadium, as was often the request of Billy Graham at the end of his sermons. There was no way he was leaving his comfy seat. There was no way he was making a commitment. There was no way he was going to be born again. He was just going to listen and go home. People started at the end of the sermon to leave their seats to go forward to Billy Graham to be saved. All of a sudden, Dad couldn't speak. He was shaking all over. He floated down the steps, crying unashamedly. Like hundreds of others that day, he asked forgiveness for his sins and accepted Jesus as his Savior. At that moment, he was born again, and his relationship with the Lord guided his life from that moment on. And now he is at home with the Lord. Tuesday, January 22nd, was not the day of his death. It was the date of his birth. It was the date of his birth into his new life with God in eternity. When Mom and Dad were first saved, they traveled several thousand miles around Canada and the United States, standing on street corners, giving out tracts, and bringing non-believers to the Lord. In the poorer areas of New Orleans and Detroit, they had to get themselves out of some pretty sticky situations with gang members, but God was watching and rescued them and brought them home safely. In April 2018, Dad lost the love of his life. From that moment on, Dad started going downhill. Following several hospital admissions, Dad succumbed. In closing, I would like to leave you with these words that Dad once shared with me. When I am gone, don't weep for me. Weep for those who have not tasted the joy of salvation. Cry hard and long for those not going to heaven. In other words, don't weep for me. I am now with the Lord. Weep long and hard for those who have not found the Lord and will not live for eternity in heaven. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for coming, and we appreciate it. And I'm just going to share some thoughts for my brothers, myself, that we've had over the years with my dad. So I entitled this, Dad, My Hero, My Friend, and Brother in Christ. My dad, where do I begin to describe my dad? A man who loved his wife of 67 years, who loved his family, a man who loved others, and a man who loved God. He taught us boys, Paul, Mark, and myself, by being a living example for others to see. As you heard, he left his life in England for a new life in Canada. What strength, vision, and hope he had. He came on a ship to this country. He had no contacts. He had no job. He had no home. And yet he built a place here and he raised a family here. So I'm going to read a thought from my cousin Mike, and this is what he said. Uncle Jim, my hero, to take your family to Canada in the late 50s in search of a better life takes a special kind of courage which many don't have. Jim and Barb, I was told, lived in a tent on the shores of Lake Ontario for several weeks until he found employment and worked 70 hours a week to move on. He rented his first tiny flat, and after years of hard work, purchased his own home in the town of Georgetown. And then with his love, rest in peace, Jim, from your nephew, Mike. My dad also, you heard, was very tight with money. Like having the heat down to 50 degrees for those, and probably 10 degrees Celsius for you younger people. What seemed, it's just wonderful seeing my breath in the morning like that. And this is how my dad saved money, because my mom would open up the oven door, turn it on, and just, I guess the hydro bill was higher than the gas bill that month, but that's how he saved money. And now we're going to look at, oh yes, there's other ways, but I'm going to read what Paul had to say about that. Paul remembers winter nights eating dinner in the dark. Yep. We were never sure what we were eating. Yep, mystery dinner. So this gave Dad an opportunity to sip some oddities such as liver or cow tongue or spotted dick or kidneys and heart and probably some Brussels sprouts. Yes. One time, Dad and Mom went on a vacation, and Paul was in his 20s, was left at home. Friends started complaining that Paul never answered the door, although the car was in the driveway. Turns out that Dad was so cheap that he disconnected the doorbell to save money. Bet that was 10 cents saved. For years, Dad begged Paul to come to the Lord, confess his sins, and get saved. Paul had no interest and resented his dad's persistence. Then at the age of 55, Paul was on a cruise and had dinner with a minister from West Virginia. The minister took Paul to his room where Paul committed his life to the Lord. He cried all night because he was so excited with what he had done. The first thing he did when the ship landed was call his dad to tell the good news. Paul had almost fell off the chair. But now all 3 sons were saved, and he was a happy man. And that was a blessing for me too. So, but my dad, that's what he wanted. Like I said, he loved his family, and that was really important to him. So, yes, my dad was always witnessing to others. He loved the Lord, and he wanted Paul to share this too. It wasn't always that way. Dad always did believe in God, but really never knew him. He would always, like Debbie said, believe, go to church, and do that stuff. But one day, his youngest son changed and started living for God. My dad almost threw that son out of the house because of that. And one day, that all changed in Hamilton at the Billy Graham Crusade when he surrendered his life to Jesus. My dad, being a toolmaker, was always building or making things. He was very good with his hands, and he always took his time to get the job perfect and right. He would make, like one time we had a good family of ours, McHale's. My dad was working and doing some drywall with Mr. McHale, and he was just taking his time trying to line up the drywall, and he had to get it perfect. And Mr. McHale says, "This isn't a machine shop, this is just my basement." And another time, I found this out to be true when Paul asked me to help out with his shed. I don't know, how many years ago was that? 20 years? So I was there late. I said, I'll be there around noon. And Paul and my dad, they were there 4 hours and nothing was getting done. And I says, "What you been doing, Dad?" "Well, making sure the dirt is perfectly level, perfectly flat." And I said, "Dad, would it be better just to level off the concrete foundation blocks instead?" So then we got things going. But that was my dad. He truly needed to think things through and make it done right. But that's what the beauty of it when he made something out of his hands. He made doll houses for his granddaughters. He made beautiful chess set for Scotty, and he made some jewelry boxes for the twins. But he would spend so much time doing that, and it was precisely and it's accurate. He even made every individual chess piece on the lathe, turned it and all that. So we made fixtures for it. It was unbelievable what he did. Such a craftsman. So that skill, that patience really comes in hand in those sort of things. My dad even built a trailer when we were kids in the basement. How do you build a trailer in the basement? I don't know. He did. How did he get it out? I don't remember, but he had it in pieces somewhere along the way. So he did that. My dad also was crazy at making Christmas gifts. Like, one time he would make this CN tower. He wrapped it up. It looked like a CN tower. I don't remember what was in it. I just remember what it looked like. But it could have been like a lamp post or something, but he would make it look something like. Another time he made, for the whites, he made this giant teacup, and I don't know what was in that either. But my dad had a way of things. One thing I do remember is one of the gifts he made for me. He made look like an airplane, and there's this kind of square thing called an LP or a record. You know, not a disc, it's like this big. And he made it look like the wings, so I wouldn't know what it was, but he disguised gifts so that you wouldn't know what it was. But that was my dad. He had the talent for doing that. He was also a real big clown. Yeah, he was a clown. He dressed up as a clown. He used to do kids' parties or go on parades. He was a real big clown. So those are things I remember as about my dad. But I'm going to read Mark's thoughts right now. Even as far back as a small boy, I remember how creative and inventive and skilled my dad was. I especially remember when I was 6 or 7, he built a full-size homemade camping trailer in our basement. He built it from the wheels up. He had a dining table, which was, we could have our meals. He made beds, he had drawers, opened up in storage units and camping supplies. The walls of the trailer could be raised up or lowered, and the canvas top was secured by large rubber bands or belts, just before Velcro, I think. And similar to today's bungee cords, he even had a hitch that could be hitched up to our car. Once it was completed, he even had a family meal in the trailer. I asked my dad, how in the world are you going to get the trailer out of this house? Well, one piece at a time. Then he disassembled it, the entire trailer, transported it outside, and then reassembled it once more. Some of my fondest memories of Dad during my childhood was when we spent our family vacation camping. We had camped from coast to coast in Canada, but my favorite place to camp was Killbear Provincial Park near Parry Sound. Even here, he showed his creative tool-making skills. He made hot dog sticks, homemade tent pegs, even a homemade pie maker. It was made to be used over a campfire, where you could make a sandwich, pie, or grilled sandwiches. I got my love of outdoors from my dad, and that's true for me too. He used to tell me stories when he was a boy and how he loved to go to the nearby woods, and he set rabbit traps and spend the day exploring the woods and even having a cookout in the woods. Like my dad, I like being in the presence of nature, being in the woods or forests or camping. Because of this, I got an interest in bird watching, which I have enjoyed doing for over 25 years. My dad was very sociable. We all know that. Very sociable. He loved to talk and share stories and tell jokes, and which he told 100 times over and over. But they were still funny because of the way he would tell them. And my dad had a way of telling stories, and we all enjoy how he shares his story. Some of those stories would get a little aggravated each time, exaggerated, sorry, each time he told them. I'm not reading my glasses, so I was probably Dad was a community-minded person. He volunteered for ambulance service, was a clown in the Santa Claus Prize, involved in local pantomime, and Dad was a simple, humble, sober man of God. He never missed an opportunity to share his love to anyone. He always was willing to share the gospel. Right up to the end of his earthly life, he would talk to Mom's PSW caregivers about the love of God and salvation. Dad was a dedicated family man. Married to the same woman for 67 years, was always loyal to her, and worked very hard to support her and his family. He was a man of wisdom, a source of knowledge and support for all of us. And that was Mark's. Now, I was always treasure the times I had with my dad. He would call me every day almost. He always had a task for me or something to fix or something like that. But that's my way of Dad asking me to come over. He needed to give me a reason, and he would do that. And I love going over, and I love doing those things for my dad. And I love going over and hearing my dad's stories, and I love hearing my dad's jokes. And even if I heard the jokes, it was like Mark said, the way he said it, I really enjoyed it. Sometimes he would give a riddle. And he's like, you didn't think about that, did you? So my dad enjoyed that. I love hearing him talking about England. I love hearing about how he grew up. I know we also shared a passion of tool making, and so I love hearing about technologies, and I would share what's going on new or something like that, or how things were made. And my dad would listen to me, and we'd talk about things. We enjoyed that.